Hello and welcome to LarpWright. Today I'm going to show you how to make a fancy, hard LARP sword sheath like this. And a prop or holder for the short sheath, so you can easily remove it. You can just use the holder on its own to hold your blade on your person, to wear your belt. And truth be told, this is not a regular how-to video. This was the first time I used this construction method. This has a fabric lining, a polystyrene plastic core and a leather outer lining, and is adorned with some brass, and I made this way too tight. I can get the sword in here, can get it out, but it just takes too much force. Many of my sheaths actually do. And the brass doesn't look as good as I wished it would look. I'm not as good a metal worker as I wish I'd be. But I think I've learned in making this prototype how you would actually make this, and I will probably make a video making one of these again in the future when I get a new and fancy sword in years to come. But for now, this is still a pretty educational, if so will, video on. The problem with making a sheath for a LARP sword is that a LARP sword is quite fat already. Real blade is slim, just a few millimeters. LARP sword is 2 centimeters wide, maybe more. So if you were to use the historical construction method, the sheath would be horribly big, fat. So we have to make a sheath that has actually very thin walls. That's why I'm using plastic polystyrene core that is formed with heat to fit around the sword. You could also laminate a fitting core, but I found this is by far the quickest and easiest method. So, if this is something that interests you, stay tuned, like and subscribe, and I show you exactly how I made these. I begin by measuring the length and circumference of the blade to cut some fabric that will make the sheath inner lining into shape. I'm using whatever fabric I had laying around, but I think the perfect fabric for the job would be synthetic velvet, panne velvet. Just gives you a very soft and slippery surface. That's the stuff they use to make the lining for violin cases, for example. So I think that would make the best material for the job. And next time I'm building a sheath, I will get myself some panne velvet to make a better sheath than this time, anyhow. Then I went and made the completely superfluous step of sewing a kind of sock from the fabric. Next time I'm doing this, I'm just gluing the lining to the inside of the plastic before forming. Speaking about plastic, this is a 1 mm thick sheet of polystyrene, a slightly flexible plastic and more importantly, it's a thermoplast. So I'm marking how wide and how long this is going to be. Need a bit of overlap here, a few centimeters to glue this together. And you can just cut this with a brake knife. And then I'm wrapping the blade in plastic foil. This will give me a bit of space when I'm forming this, so I don't form it too tight, but I could have used more space, a lot more space. Actually could have made this way thicker. And it will protect the blade from the heat of the next step. Because the next step is to take a heat gun and heat up the polystyrene. As I said, it's a thermoplast. It becomes really soft and pliable, and then you can just wrap it around the blade and it will become and stay, once it is cooled, the perfect shape for the sheath. And of course before I have done that, I should have sanded it all and glued the lining to the inside. That would have made the next steps so much easier. After the sheet is formed, I'm cutting to a rough shape a piece of goat skin left over from my water skin projects, and then stain it with leather stain. I should have also soaked it in water before, so I wouldn't need to apply so much stain. Well, you live and learn. I will cut this into final shape after gluing it on. To glue this on, after testing if I'm getting the best position, I'm using my trusted Curvelfix cobbler's glue that can be used to glue shoe soles to shoes. Very tough and it stays flexible. And I'm just spreading some on the non-stained, on the rough side of the leather, and then wrap it around the sheath and make sure it's good and tight. And I think at this point I should have let the blade be in the sheath. I should have kept the blade in the sheath for this part, so I wouldn't wrap it on too tight, and used a bit more of the plastic foil than I have. Once the glue has dried for at least an hour, or better overnight, I'm getting out my leather sewing kit and I'm making a neat stitch along the length of the sheath to keep it holding together and make it look nice. I'm using a sewing awl here, but you could also use 2 needles and do a saddler stitch. And this goat's leather is so thin, there's no need to pre-punch holes into it. You can just go through it with the needle and sew right away. And now, after sewing, I trim the leather to its final shape. This part is mostly for decoration, but a bit of brass and the mouth and the tip of the sheath will make it look much nicer, much more expensive. It's also kind of a pain in the ass to do. This is 0.3 millimeter thin brass sheet, which is very easy to cut and form by hand. Last time I used a millimeter thick sheet and that didn't work out at all. So this time I've gotten wiser, and you can just cut this with a nice pair of sheet metal scissors. Then sand off, I guess that's technical, right? English today. Sand off all of the corners, so there are no sharp corners, no sharp edges anymore, and form it by hand to fit to the sheath. Using 2 vices here, maybe you should go up to even 3 vices to keep it in shape while the glue sets. Next day I'm cutting more of the brass for the tip of the sheath. As you can see, I've got a brass pattern here, which I'm modifying, and I should have really done this in cardboard on paper, but I thought, no, I'll do it with the brass right away. So I ended up wasting a lot of brass to come up with a good shape that I could bend around the tip, but I am not that happy how the tip turned out. Quite happy how the brass looks at the mouth of the sword, but the tip, it's a more complicated form, and I'm not really experienced in shaping metal. So either I have to train this so I get better at it, or do something else for the tip, like gluing and wrapping leather cord around it, or flax cord, twine, that would be possible, or more leather, another layer of hardened leather maybe. But brass does look cool, doesn't it? Once all of the glue has set and is dry, I'm wiping off the excess with isopropanol alcohol and an old towel I can throw away after. To fasten this to my belt, I'm making a frop, as Shad from Shadiversity called it. It's a holder that will hold it at a 45-degree angle in this case. And I'll make it adjustable in circumference, so I can adjust it finely to this sheath. So I can put the sheath in and take the sheath out without taking off my belt, because this will go onto my regular belt and I don't want to take it off when I take off the sword. That is the whole thought process behind this little doohickey here. But it's super easy to make, and you could use it as a sword holder for LARP. Will work really well just holding the sword. And I may end up just using the prop because the sheath is just so tight and it's so hard to pull the blade out. So I may end up just using the prop. So after measuring, or rather trying out the circumference, I'm cutting a length of about 2 millimeter, maybe 3 millimeter thick kettle leather, and then I'm punching a number of holes into the sides. I'm just eyeballing where they should go here. I also need a number of leather straps to hang this from the belt, so I'm cutting like 10 millimeter, 50 millimeter thick stripes from the same leather. And then it's time to soak it all in lukewarm water to make it nice and pliable. This makes it easy to form it into the shape of the prop, or the sword holder. And it will also make it easier to stain all of this in the next step. But before I stain this, I want to have all the holes I need for this punched. Once the stain has dried, and I mean really dried overnight, not the alibi dry that I've used, you should wipe off, polish off the excess stain with a piece of cloth or a piece of paper, piece of kitchen paper, and then soak it again so you can form it for final assembly. And I decided to rivet the straps on and lace the prop together with a bit of leather string, but you could also put more straps and buckles onto the prop to hold it in place. You could even put buttons on it if you're so fancy. Depending on how rich and fanciful your character is, you can give this prop or your sword holder a different kind of look. But for the ranger I decided that lacing it is good enough. Also had to fiddle quite a bit with both the rivets, as I somehow messed up how I riveted it together. and then I had to fiddle with the lacing so it wouldn't be too tight and have just enough play to pull the sheath from the frop and put it back in without too much resistance while it will still hold it. But this finishes the build. Let it dry, maybe put a bit of oil or leather fat on the frop, on your new sword holder, on the sheath, and you're done. Probably will make this again at some point when I get a new expensive sword, but for now, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.